All right, here are your chapter one notes. There's just one PowerPoint on all of chapter one. Okay, and so we're just looking at energy flow in the biosphere. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about food webs and food chains and so on. Okay, so one of the outcomes that you have to know is explain what trophic levels are using food webs and food chains. We'll also talk about like producers and different levels and what that means. All right, so energy transfer in food webs. Energy flows through systems can be easily seen when categorizing living things into their different trophic levels. Okay, and so basically the trophic levels are made up of organisms that are similar. So like the first trophic level is made up of organisms that can make their own food. Another name for these organisms is producers. They can produce their own foods, or autotrophs. Okay, and so producers or autotrophs make their own food. So these are plants, okay, that undergo photosynthesis and make their own food, and so on. Okay, the energy from the first trophic level is then transferred to the second trophic level when we and that's where we have our primary consumers. Okay, so the energy from the second trophic level is then transferred to the third trophic level, where we have our secondary consumers and so on. Okay, so primary consumers in the second trophic level are the different things that eat the plants or the autotrophs. So any plant-eating animal would be considered a primary consumer. The secondary consumers in the third trophic level would be something that would eat the primary consumers. So like in a really basic food web, okay, we'd have grass as a autotroph or producer, and then primary consumer would be cows, and then we eat the cows, so we would be a secondary consumer in that case. Okay, some more examples here. So like first trophic level producers, we got a couple different plants there. Some secondary trophic level primary consumers, deer, mice, again, anything that eats plants. And then the third trophic level, the secondary consumers, so the wolves would eat the deer, the hawks would eat the mice, and they would be the secondary consumers. Energy transfer in food webs. So now we kind of know the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. Okay, they're also referred to as heterotrophs. Okay, because they need to obtain their energy by eating something else. Okay, so autotrophs, they make their own food. Heterotrophs need to get their food from something else. So they cannot make their own food. Every organism within an ecosystem provides energy for another organism. Food chains are used to show the kind of step-by-step sequence, who eats whom in an ecosystem. Okay, food chains are also used to show the one-way flow of energy. Okay, so the first trophic level, we have our producer. Second trophic level, we have our primary consumer. So in this case, the deer eats the tree, or like might use the tree bark or whatever it eats for nourishment, and then the wolves are going to eat the deer. Okay, so again, autotrophs create their own food using the sun, so undergo photosynthesis. Okay, primary consumers are the ones that eat the producers and are considered herbivores. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers and are considered carnivores. Okay, decomposers are present in the ecosystems as well, but we don't represent them in the food chain. They eat, once something dies, they kind of take care of that dead material, okay, and put it back into the soil or into the land. Okay, so yeah, they feed on dead material. The tree, or Okay, basically the dead material of all producers, consumers, really anything that was alive and is now dead, the decomposers are going to take care of that. Okay, a food web, okay, is used to show the feeding relationships among organisms in a whole ecosystem. So it's made of different food chains and tend to look a lot more complicated. Really, like when you think of a food chain, going back to the earlier example, like it's just like tree, deer, wolves. When you look at that food chain, like it looks like deer will only eat the trees and the wolves will only eat deer and so on. Where in fact, like deer, like the wolves will eat many different primary consumers. It doesn't have to only be a deer. And same thing, deer can also eat grass and different types of vegetation. And so it doesn't just have to have the trees. So in a food web, it's going to show a lot more of those relationships. Okay, so an ecosystem with a higher biodiversity has much more busy looking food webs, basically more arrows. Okay, one with lower biodiversity, or they'll have the higher biodiversity will have more arrows compared to lower biodiversity. Again, biodiversity just means amount of living things in that ecosystem. Okay, and so the more higher biodiversity, the more feeding relationships to kind of account for. Okay, with low biodiversity, so in a place like the Arctic, it's very limited what the consumers can eat. Okay, if you look at like the polar bear, it mostly relies on seals, things like that. It doesn't have a lot of different things that it can eat. Where if you look at like a grasslands or like a forest type area that has higher biodiversity, the wolves, which are the secondary consumer, they have deer, they have um, mice and coyotes, and there's a lot more rabbits and things like that that they can eat. It's not limited to just kind of one main thing. Okay, so the most stable ecosystems, those with the greatest biodiversity, have such a complex and well developed food webs that the reduction in numbers or even the complete removal of one type of organism would only have a small effect on the overall web. Okay, if you just take something off of it, they'll just eat something else. Okay, where in a less biodiversity, if you take something off of, and that's what something relies 100% for food, they're going to die out also. So the reason that more biodiverse ecosystems can handle these changes is because typically the organisms are eating more than one thing. There's a lot of different options for them. Okay, and we can think of, like for us, okay, we eat more than one thing every day, and at least we should to get a balanced diet. So like if you only had to eat one thing every meal, only lettuce, okay, if all the lettuce disappeared, okay, like if we could still survive. Okay, and that's what we can even see right now with this COVID thing going on. Okay, there's some things that just aren't on the shelves anymore that you might usually eat. Okay, and so you just adjust and eat something else. It's no big deal. Okay, if you only relied on one thing though and that got taken off the shelf, then you could be in trouble. Okay, so this is what a food web looks like. So like it's not a lot more complex, but it's a little more complex than just the basic food chain. And again, like each of these has a basic food chain in it. Okay, but now it's just it's showing more of the animals and the plants and stuff that are in the ecosystem. Okay, so the lower the biodiversity of ecosystem, the simpler the food web, and the more vulnerable each organism is to changes in that ecosystem. Okay, and so this food web here, like we have our at the bottom level here is our producers, our autotrophs. Okay, our secondary consumers would be all of these in the middle here, so the gopher, mouse, foal, or moose, deer, and elk, and then our secondary consumer is our wolf at the top. Okay, photosynthesis and respiration. We did a whole unit on those, so we're going to go over these fairly quick. But Food webs always begin with autotrophs, such as plants, okay, and all of the living things use some sort of chemical energy for food. So green plants make their own food using carbon dioxide and water, plus energy from the sun, and they make glucose, which then is taken throughout the plant, and that's what they use for nourishment and for cellular respiration. Okay, so yeah, plants accomplish the feat through the process of photosynthesis. You should know this balanced chemical equation. We've done like the whole unit on this, so it should be already in your head. So since photosynthetic organisms are the first trophic level, this process essentially provides energy for the entire ecosystem. Okay, so that's the more plants you have, usually the greater biodiversity, because you're getting all of the nourishment for the whole ecosystem from that first level. Okay, and so as you move through the trophic levels of an ecosystem, the energy from the plants is then transferred to different organisms. All the organisms, including the plant, use cellular respiration to use energy in their food. So that's the plants produce their own food, then use their cellular respiration to get that energy from their food. Okay, animals eat the plants, okay, or eat other animals to get the food energy that to then undergo cellular respiration. Okay, and cellular respiration breaks down the glucose, releasing energy that can then be used by cells. Okay, and so respiration, this is its chemical equation. So glucose plus oxygen produce CO2 and H2O, and then give us the energy we need. Okay, as you can see, the reaction of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are complementary to each other. As we know from that unit, it's a lot more complex than just these straight up glucose and oxygen producing CO2 and H2O. Okay, but for this unit, that's as far as we need to know. Okay, if we do not have photosynthesis, we do not have sugar to feed cellular respiration, and all life on Earth would cease to exist. So without the plants, nothing else can live. And so that's why if you look at most ecosystems that have high biodiversity, they have a lot of plants. So like the rainforest has the greatest biodiversity in the world. It has the most plant life in the world also. Okay, chemosynthesis. So not all food webs begin with a photosynthetic organism. Okay, there's different options to obtain that energy. Okay, again, for photosynthesis to happen, there has to be light. Okay, that's part of it. That's what the photo stands for in photosynthesis. Okay, there is some ecosystems in caves or deep in the ocean where light does not penetrate, where producers convert simple molecules into more complex compounds without solar energy, and this was a process called chemosynthesis. Okay, and so basically they're using chemicals in the ocean or in these caves to then produce their own food. So they're still producing their own food, they're still autotrophs. Okay, and so that's why the organisms that can do this are called chemoautotrophs. They're still producing their own food, they're just using a different process. So bacteria that can accomplish this task only require carbon dioxide and water and some sort of energy source other than the sun to make the nutrients. So a lot of times these bacteria and stuff, if they live at the bottom of the ocean, are near different heated places that can give off energy. The chemical energy is then extracted from inorganic molecules like hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, or sulfur. Yeah, and so those would give off the energy, and then it's using the carbon dioxide and water to then produce their own food. Okay, and so you can kind of think of this if you've ever been to a natural hot spring, so Banff, Radium, Revelstoke, Fairmont. Okay, the heat from these hot springs is used by the chemoautotrophs to dissolve hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide into organic or usable compounds, so sugars, and they then use this to create food. So it's just really similar process to photosynthesis, but because they don't have access to the sun, they use these hot springs or like the different chemicals, okay, to then produce the food. Limits on energy transfer. So every time energy is transferred between the components of the ecosystem, the amount of energy available to the next trophic level is reduced. Okay, why that happens? Okay, it has to do with the laws of thermodynamics. So the first law, energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. So really, when you look at that law, the energy has to be transformed or transferred from one level to the next. Okay, but the second law states during energy transfer, some energy is lost as heat. Okay, and that's a big one. That's what most of our energy is lost as it goes up the trophic levels. So each time energy is transformed, some energy is lost from the system. So we have another example here of our food web. We have our producers that get our energy from the sun, okay, and then they send it on. So as the consumers eat it, thermal energy is lost. Okay, and then as the next level, consumers that eat it, more thermal energy is lost, and then the decomposers, okay, take that energy. There's also energy lost to thermal energy in that case, okay, but then they create the matter that goes back into and is used for growth in other cases. Okay, so example of kind of input energy. So 100% of the producer's energy, from that, 63% of that energy is lost by metabolism. Okay, and then like 16.2 goes to primary consumers, and then 20.4 to the decomposers. Okay, and actually we'll use the rule of like 10%. Each level loses or only gains 10% of the energy from the level before, and we'll talk about that in our next set of notes. But basically, like if you kind of think about like the producers, the animal that eats the energy from the producers only gets 10% of that energy. 90% is lost to thermal energy, and then the secondary consumer that eats the primary consumer only gets 10% as it goes up the line. Okay, we don't have to worry about these questions. We already did your worksheet on chapter 1. You need to do assignment 1.1 and 1.2. And then this is a short chapter, so you'll have your quiz after we're done chapter 2.